What is up? What is going on? Welcome back to the COVID-19 War Room. I am your host, Coach Patterson. Today we are going over Reconstruction Part Number 1. We have a two-part series on Reconstruction. Today we're going to hit number 1. Without further ado, let's jump into the computer. So like I said, we're talking about Reconstruction today. And first we need to talk about the problems that are facing the United States. Now Reconstruction is going to be the time that's directly after the Civil War. So we're talking about trying to put the United States back together, construct it back together into one nation that can be peacefully there and living in the same place, getting the Confederate States of America back together with the United States. So the first problem that we have is, what do you do with 4 million freed slaves? Right? You now have 4 million new people that have rights, need services, things like that, need jobs, all that. So what are we going to do as a nation with 4 million freed slaves and their families? The second problem that we're going to have is, what do you do with the Confederate States that left the Union? How do they get back in? And then the third problem is going to be, who's in charge of getting them back together? Who's going to be in charge of making sure that the Confederate States are, going to stay and not going to secede again, and the peace is going to be restored again? Who's going to be in charge of all of that? And so those are the problems that we need to face, we need to answer, and let's start with who's in charge. So at this point, Lincoln is in office. He's not yet been assassinated, and he comes up with the 10% plan. The 10% plan is honestly pretty lenient on the South, and that was a criticism that he got for it. But Lincoln's 10% plan called for all Confederates, except military and political leaders, to regain citizenship by taking an oath to support the Confederacy, to support the Constitution and the 13th Amendment. So basically, hey, we're sorry, can we come back? Yeah, you can. Just say that you love us again and recognize that all the freed slaves are now citizens. Okay, and so once a state had 10% of the people in that state to do that, they were able to come back, and the state would be recognized by the president and by the government. In 1864, the states of Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas were already done. They had their 10%. Everything was good, and Lincoln recognized them as back being states. Now that is before the Civil War is even over. So as you know, the Civil War ended in 1865. So it's pretty lenient, right? You left, let's just be like you running away from home. Right before you left, you took $500 from your parents, and then you came back. They wanted you to come back, and basically no punishment for you stealing their money and leaving. They can just say, all right, come back and we'll accept you. And that, that's a choice that the United States has, but it got some criticism based on that. So Congress thought that Lincoln's plan was way too lenient, and so they came up with their own Reconstruction plan, and they called that the Wade-Davis bill. In that bill, it stated that Congress, not the president, should be in charge for Reconstruction and letting the former states back into the Union. The majority of the people in the Confederate States, so 50% rather than 10%, needed to take that oath of allegiance. Confederate political and military leaders were disenfranchised, so not allowed to vote. Confederate debts would be repaid to the Union by the Confederate States and not by the United States. So we had a little conflict brewing between the president and his Congress, and we're going to have to see how that plays out. But unfortunately, we never get to see that, because Lincoln is assassinated in April of 1865 before we can even really get Reconstruction underway. And so we're going to have to kind of start over from scratch again, and that's when we meet Andrew Johnson, not Jackson, Johnson. So Johnson he becomes the president after Lincoln is assassinated. And so he's got a plan. He's going to plan to pardon all Southerners except for Confederate leaders and wealthy plantation owners. He's going to recognize the governments of Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and all the other states could re-enter the Union once they wrote a new state constitution, elected a new state government, and ratified the 13th Amendment, paid their debts, and repealed their acts of secession. So basically, you had to do all that to get back into the good graces of the United States. But once you did that, you were scot-free and could come on back. So this is Johnson's plan. It goes into effect. Congress doesn't really, they don't really agree, but the plan goes into effect, and it doesn't turn out all that well for the United States. Number one, ex-Confederate states quickly qualify. It's pretty easy to do, right? You go back to whatever it was. So you repeal your acts, basically copy over your old state constitution that you had before you left the Union. You get all that stuff back in order, and you're back in. The problem is that none of the Confederate states gave the African American men, the freed slaves, the right to vote. Former Confederate leaders were just simply elected to Congress by the people that voted to secede from the Union, and then the Congress got angry and they wouldn't seat the Confederate leaders. So now you've got a problem where you have a duly elected representative and Congress is refusing to seat them. So now we have another clash between a president and Congress. So, some response to Johnson's plan. Southern legislators adopted black codes, which are basically anything that restricts a African American or freed slave. So these prohibited African Americans from renting or borrowing money, to buy land or rent a house, placed freedmen in a form of semi-bondage by forcing them to sign work contracts, and we'll get to that. You know, what did freed slaves do? It's prohibited African Americans from testifying against white people in court, and also led to the development of the KKK, or the Ku Klux Klan, which was a white supremacy group that basically just suppressed African Americans altogether. And here we have some pictures of KKK. This is obviously an artist's drawing. You see in the back it says Freedman School on the top, and this is probably somebody that's teaching and is getting beat right now by the KKK. Here's just a KKK meeting, just so you're familiar with this process here. So look at me, I am the captain now, little Captain Phillips here. So at this point, Congress is going to, a couple years later, Congress is going to have an election. They're going to get enough votes that allow them to take over Reconstruction. Basically, how they're allowed to take over Reconstruction is they can now override any presidential veto. Okay, so they have a 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate, and they can override presidential vetoes pretty easily. So all they're going to do is pass a law. They're going to send it to him, send it to the president, send it to Johnson. Johnson's going to hit that veto, put that big stamp on it. It's going to come back to the House and Senate. They're just going to vote, override it based on our Constitution and checks and balances. Get a 2/3 vote. You override a presidential veto. So they can pretty much do anything that they want as far as Reconstruction is concerned. So Johnson's out. He's no longer in charge of Reconstruction. And so now it's going to be Congress the rest of the way until we get to the military. But this congressional Reconstruction is going to be led by the radical Republicans. You have Stevens in the House and Sumner in the Senate that are going to be leading the charge of these radical Republicans. And basically a radical Republican is just somebody that, kind of wants to punish the South a little bit. It's one of our vocabulary words, but wants to punish the South and make sure that none of this stuff is going to happen again. So what did the radical Republican plan call for? They wanted to basically put it under military rule. So you had the Congress kind of giving up control to the military in a way to make sure that order is restored in the South. So during this military rule, African Americans would be free to exercise their civil rights. They would be educated in schools operated by the federal government, most of them by the Freedmen's Bureau, and they had a plan to offer them 40 acres and a mule. If you've ever heard that saying, however, this never actually became a reality. So here are the military districts that were divided up. You can see Virginia was number 1, North and South Carolina number 2, Alabama, Georgia, Florida number 3, Arkansas, Mississippi number 4, Texas and Louisiana number 5. So Texas in the 5th military district under the command of Sheridan, and it wasn't like, it was martial law. So martial law is basically the military's in charge. They make the laws, everything, because at this point Congress has kind of unrecognized everybody, and so they have no law. They don't have a state, but so the military's out there just kind of keep everybody in line and in check. So radical Reconstruction is officially underway. Congress is going to reinstate the Freedmen's Bureau that had kind of lapsed. The funding had stopped being approved and all that. But they're going to refund the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to override Johnson's veto and pass the 1866 Civil Rights Act, and they're going to pass the 14th Amendment. And we're going to get into all three of those here. So the Freedmen's Bureau, what was it? What did it do? Kind of more in depth before we just kind of glance over it, and because it was a pretty important program for about 10 years, I guess 5-7 years. So it was established in 1865 by Lincoln to assist the freed slaves in the South. In 1866, the charter was renewed by Congress, and this is going to help freedmen find separated family members, teach them how to read and write, act as legal advocates, so if they get in trouble with the law or anything like that. This is basically just going to be a place for somebody to help them, where they can go and they know that they can go and get help that's not going to, be, what's the right word? Facetious, I guess. So a lot of times, you get these free slaves, and you have some white men that would say, "Hey, yeah, we'll help you." But really, they're just trying to take advantage of them, and we'll see that when we get to sharecropping and stuff like that. So this is just kind of a non-biased organization that's literally there just for the sole purpose of helping the freed slaves do what they need to do to be successful in life. So some critics believe that it was, holding them back, keeping them from being independent, and in a way you can see it, but at the same time, you've pretty much flipped these guys' life 180. From being a slave to being free overnight is quite the transition to make. So why didn't it last? Funding cuts, and then the Ku Klux Klan, they were burning down buildings, burning down schools, killing people. They did not want the African American men to succeed in the United States. So that was kind of the downfall of the Freedmen's Bureau. And then in 1872, the charter was not renewed, and so the Freedmen's Bureau was basically gone at that point. So here's some pictures. You can see kind of the hostility that is with between the white men and then the African Americans on the other side. You've got a Freedmen's Bureau worker trying to keep the peace there, but it doesn't look like that's going to last very long. Here's a schoolhouse. You can just see, you've got children getting educated with the teacher there in front. Freedmen voting. in 1867, they had the right. This is before. This is probably in the North, because in the South they made it almost impossible for them to actually vote. So this is probably going to be in the North, not in the South. So what is the Civil Rights Act of 1866? So Congress overrides Johnson's veto and passes this. Like I said, they have that ability to override the veto, and they're going to use it here. The act was the first attempt to define citizenship as stated, and stated that all citizens have equal protection under the law. So this one is going to lead to the 14th Amendment. So in 1866, Congress passes the 14th Amendment, which states that all people born naturalized in the United States are a United States citizen, have the full rights to the protection of its law. And so this is basically, saying that the freed slaves are citizens because either they were born here or they've been here long enough to where there can be naturalized citizens. And that 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. So you thought you were back in. This is going to be talking to some of those Confederate states. Throughout Johnson's plan, he had allowed certain states to rejoin the Union, but basically when Congress took back over, the only state that they recognized as being back in the Union was Tennessee. So all of these states basically had to start over, and in order for the former Confederate states to reenter the Union, they had to pass a state constitution granting African Americans the right to vote, ratify the 14th Amendment, and agree that former Confederate leaders could not hold office. And that's great and all, but they're just going to have caveat workarounds there. So they're going to pass a law that says, yeah, everybody has the right to vote, but then they're going to pass black codes that make it so if you have the right to vote, but in order to vote you have to pass a literacy test. So you have to be able to read, write, spell your name, all that. Well, if you're a free slave, you don't really have that ability. So they are gonna have the right to vote, but then they're gonna make conditions on it, and that's really just gonna hold people back even more. So that's it. That's it for part one. Thank you for joining us. If you're from my class, welcome back. If you're from a different class, welcome. From a different district, love to have you here. That is going to wrap up part one of Reconstruction. In the next video, we'll hit part two and kind of wrap up Reconstruction to the end and look at Texas a little bit more in depth. So I hope that you join us in the next one, and we'll see you there.